Thank you for that, Mike. That was quite good. Well, I'm here today to talk about immigration. It's our core policy, and it's at the essence of the BNP. We believe that immigration is destructive and must be stopped, because without any vote or debate, successive governments of Britain have brought in millions of people and transformed this country beyond recognition. You've only got to look, especially in London, where we are now a minority in our own capital city. They've done this. So immigration and multiculturalism has been an absolute disaster for this country. Now it's Labour and Conservative mainly that are behind it. What Labour have done, there are two reasons why they brought in millions of immigrants. First of all, for the votes. Most immigrants will vote Labour. That's why they bring it in. That's why they'll never stop immigration. They'll make noises, oh, we made a mistake, or we'll have to limit the thing, but you cannot trust them. They need the votes. And the other reason is because they have a desire to change the ethnicity of this country. Perhaps it's rooted in Marxism. They believe in no nations, no borders. They want to change this country, and they've admitted it. Now that to me is a crime. That is ethnocide. And it's against the United Nations mandate on the rights of indigenous peoples to bring in, to transform in such huge numbers, to transform the character of the country, to lessen the influence of the indigenous population. That's what they've done. That's why I believe Tony Blair, Jack Straw, Mandelson, they should be called to account for it. They belong in jail. Now, most people in this country agree with us. They will say, a vast majority of people, about 70-odd%, agree that immigration has gone too far. Even the immigrants will agree it's gone too far. When I was out canvassing, I think it was about last year, this woman came up to me. She said, I'm from Singapore. I came to this country 40 years ago. And then she said, do you know what's wrong with this country? I said, what? She said, too much immigration. So even they, because they face the same pressures as the rest of us, their sons and daughters can't get on the property ladder. They're having difficulty getting their children into the right school. They face problems with the NHS. So even they, and a couple of weeks ago, this Indian person, he said, I've come to this country 30 years ago. He said, basically, I wanted to come to England as it was. I've seen in the books, but he said, I might as well have stayed there because this looks like India to me. So there you go. And we know that it causes a lot of problems. NHS, I'm waiting for an operation. I don't know when that will happen. Schools, employment, jobs, overcrowding. And we've seen that. And housing especially. We can't build them fast enough. Most of the new homes are going to immigrants. So we're playing catch up all the time, and we're making it more crowded. Now, there are a couple of boroughs in London. I'll just mention three: Brent, Newham and Tower Hamlets. Now in Brent, it was the first borough where the indigenous population became a minority. Now they're always telling us, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight's myths of immigration. They're always telling us that immigrants bring prosperity. They add to the GDP of this country. But if you look at Brent, it's classified as a deprived area. Now after all that immigration, it's still a deprived area. And for a brief time, they were tuberculosis was rife there, it still is. It was the most, had the most rate of tuberculosis in the Western world, and higher than some Central African countries. Now, when it's pointed out, and people say, well, it's the immigrants, they say, no, nothing to do with immigrants. They say it's to do with poverty. But I question this. I said, well, if immigrants bring prosperity, and they're in Brent, then why is there poverty? They said, well, they're not building enough houses. Now, what they're doing in Brent, and in many other, they're living in, they've got beds in sheds, they call it. They're living in sheds, garages, outhouses, and that's what's going on. So it's bad in Brent, but Newham has taken over as the tuberculosis capital of the Western world. It's gone even worse there. Again, they say it's nothing to do with immigrants, it's poverty, but Newham is full of immigrants. So how can this be? If immigrants bring prosperity, why are the areas they're going into still poor? It doesn't make sense. Something is wrong. Now, there are several myths, and I'd like to talk briefly about them. You've got the myth where they say that there's a skills shortage. We need immigrants because of skill shortages. This is a myth. When employers say they can't get the staff, what they really mean to say is we can't get the staff at the low wage that we're willing to pay. You see, because you don't have to give someone a passport to work here. And that's what it's all about. What they say is, and I've seen it happen, I've seen people get made redundant. They said, we need workers. I've seen them leave work at Friday, and in Monday there's someone sitting in their desk doing exactly the same work for a lower wage. And we've seen that British Airways fiasco. If you remember, the airports were shut, all their flights were cancelled. That was because they got rid of 700 highly experienced British computer staff. They got rid of them, and instead they employed 700 very inexperienced Indian IT workers, and the whole thing keeps crashing. It's the same with the national NHS computer system. It was scrapped a few years ago at the cost of £12 billion because they relied on foreign workers. So immigration is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Whenever employees say we can't get the staff, remember they can't get the staff at the low wage they want to pay. And I can't believe that there's no one in this country who could do the job that they advertise. That's what it's all about. I believe it's better. Another myth is they say we need immigrants because we need someone to do the work. But let's break. You don't have to give them immigration status. You don't have to give them a passport to work here. Most of the world, they use a temporary work permit system, and it works very well. They're not allowed to bring their wives and their children over. They're not allowed to claim housing benefits. They're not given social housing. The employer should pay for that. Now, we should have such a system in this country. Someone said to me, but if we had such a system, we wouldn't be able to attract foreign workers. I said, yes, exactly. That's the point, isn't it? Another myth, which I hear all the time, and celebrities are used to saying this, they say we are a nation of immigrants. Therefore, we have to allow in more immigrants. Well, that's like saying, if you're an alcoholic, well, you've had a drink, you've always drunk, so you must carry on drinking. It's like a heavy smoker. Well, you've smoked in the past, so why not carry on smoking? Or a drug user. You've taken drugs, so carry on. So what they're saying is, you've had immigrants in the past, so you must carry on having immigrants. Now that's absolute nonsense. Even if you had a country, 100% recent immigrants, that nation has a right to say enough is enough. And then they say, well, they go on, bring out a list where we had Romans, Vikings, Saxons, Normans. I point out to them that the Romans, for example, these were not immigrants, they were invaders. And there is a difference. Now, they're assuming that we had these invaders, they call them immigrants, I call them invaders, they're assuming that they came over in their millions and they started breeding with the local women. But that's simply not true. Now the Romans came, there were 3 invasions. 55 BC, they came over with 10,000 soldiers. A year, then they had won a few battles, they went back to France. 54 BC, a year later, they brought over 32,000. Then they left us alone for 50 years. And I think it was 43 AD, they came over with 50,000 and they stayed for 400 years. Now, what effect did that have on the bloodline? Well, I tell you, it was insignificant. They estimate now that there's about between 1 and 2% of people with any Roman blood in them. I saw a program, I think 6 months ago, where scientists, they were looking for someone with some Roman blood in them, and they found one person on the south coast. So that's a myth, and you'll hear a lot of that. The Romans, Normans, these were invaders, and they didn't change the bloodline significantly. And up until the Second World War, we were the most homogeneous nations on earth. So don't believe that myth. This is a myth that really annoys me. Immigrants are less likely to claim benefits. Right. I hear this on LBC. There's one particular presenter. Any debate about immigration, he always repeats it. Immigrants are less likely to claim benefits, you know, and he keeps saying it. Now, he's working on the principle, if you tell a lie often enough, people are going to believe it. And every time I turn on the radio, immigrants are less likely. I traced the source of that. What it was a study which concentrated mainly on European Union migrants. And then they only concentrated on out-of-work benefits. And it was true that they do claim, under that particular thing, they do claim less benefits in that if you concentrate on them out of work, but that can be explained quite easily because the EU migrants are usually in their 20s or 30s, so they're younger than the general population. That means they claim less health benefits. So it was skewed, that survey they did. They did it to get the right result, so it doesn't look too good. But if you include in-work benefits, which they didn't, there's a huge amount of money paid out in housing benefit, income support, working tax credits. And if you compare that, then they're far more likely to claim benefits than the rest of us. And it's noticeable that they only concentrated on EU workers. If they'd have looked at Muslims, 80% of Muslims get some sort of benefit in work or out of work. So this is what they're doing. They're concentrating, they're looking at the data, and they're saying, leaving out parts of it. And they're saying that, well, migrants, it's EU migrants, and that particular one was in work, out of work benefits. So you have to be careful when you hear this rubbish talked, especially on the radio, TV. I've heard it a lot. That's a complete myth. It's like if some of you are old enough to remember we used to get surveys from so-called scientists. Well, they were scientists about smoking. They said smoking is good for you. Some university report had come out, smoking is good for you. Some scientists have said so. It was investigated. What if they found out was that these scientists were paid indirectly by the tobacco companies. And what they probably did, they got probably some heavy smokers, and they said they deprived them of cigarettes for 24 hours probably. And then they gave them a cigarette. And they said, how do you feel? They said, well, I feel great. All right. Smokers feel great. 95% of people feel great. So they're manipulating the data. This is what they do with immigration surveys. And you may remember sugar corporations. They used to have surveys saying sugar gives you a lot of energy. Sugar's good for you. Scientists have said so. But what they don't tell you, there's a price to pay, because it gives you energy because it raises the blood sugar level. But what they don't tell you is that it's linked to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. They left that out, these scientists. And once again, they were paid indirectly by the sugar corporations. So I'm using those examples to illustrate how data can be skewed to arrive at the result that you want. This is what they do with immigration surveys. They leave out a lot. Labour Party, they're always coming up with immigrants bring benefits. They add 6 billion a year to the GDP. What they don't tell you is, it's gross domestic product. What they don't tell you is that if you add immigrants, yes, if you add people, it's going to increase GDP because that measures output. But there was a House of Lords Economic Committee, Migration Advisory Committee, they both said that the thing they should concentrate on, what effect does it have on the GDP of the host population? And if you consider that, all the evidence says that immigration benefits immigrants mainly. And it has little effect on the rest of us, especially those lower down the economic scale. But they keep repeating this, oh, immigrants, they bring economic benefits, but not to us, to themselves, yes, and to greedy employers, not to the rest of us. So basically, that when you hear politicians, it brings benefits. They say it with such conviction. Some people they fall for it. They say they bring economic benefits, but you have to question this. They bring economic benefits to themselves. And the serious studies, there was one done at University College London, it estimated the net effect, the fiscal impact on this country, and it was minus, between 1995 and 2011, they estimated that the cost of this country was up to 160 billion. That's over 26 million pounds a day. That was the net negative effect on this country. So what they're doing is they're quoting misleading, they're taking chunks out of here, manipulating the data, and it's all a big con. Here's mention this one. You'll hear it a lot from Labour MPs. They say life began in Africa, so it's immoral to stop immigration from Africa because we all came from Africa. Now, that's a myth because it was started. I'll tell you where it came from. It started by two social scientists in the early 80s. They produced an academic paper with a theory, not a fact, a theory that life began in Africa. Now, this was immediately picked up by all the liberal lefties. Life began in Africa, so you cannot stop immigration, you must let everyone in. But since the advent of advanced DNA techniques, it's been proved that that theory is wrong, because simply put, people would have DNA, African DNA, but they don't. It's now gone so advanced you can tell where you're from, where the people, where your parents, grandparents, etc., tracing all the way back. If we were from Africa, we'd have some DNA, African DNA, but we don't. Now, the two scientists who came up with this theory now admit that their theory was wrong. But it doesn't stop the Labour Party saying life began in Africa. So that's another one to look out for. Oh yeah. So the Labour Party will never stop it. They need the votes. They want to change the ethnicity of this country. The Tories will never stop it either. And the reason for that is their paymasters, the multinational companies, the big business, they demand cheap labour. So you'll get them at every election saying, oh, well, don't worry, we're going to do something about it. Like David Cameron said when he got into power 2010, we're going to do something about immigration. He didn't, it got worse. So they're all talk. Now UKIP, they came out with a policy for a long time saying 50,000, we need an Australian-style points-based system for skilled workers. What they didn't tell people is that we already got one. It was brought in by Labour, 2008. And the limit now is about 21,000, just above 21,000. And yet there they were saying we need 50,000, skilled worker program Australian. The system that was brought in by Labour, 21,000, and it was based on the Australian system. Now, I pointed this out to some UKIP people over the internet. They said, I don't believe you. I said, well, send me your email address. I'll send you the PDF from the government office. So I sent it, and they said, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. So we're being lied to. Now they've come up with a net one in, one out system. It sounds reasonable on the face of it, it sounds reasonable, but it's not. Because for every person that comes into the country, it's probably the head of the household. They don't count their wives, they don't count their children, and most importantly, they don't count chain migration, where family reunification programs, brothers, sisters, fathers, so you're not letting in one, you're letting in about 10. And they take no account of that. And a point about this net migration, they've underestimated the number of people coming in because of chain migration, because of their children, and they've overestimated the number of people who emigrate. Now I looked into this, and I asked them, well, how do you know if somebody's emigrated? They say, oh, well, we take a guess. So what do you mean? They say 300,000 people leave the country to emigrate. I don't believe it. And I'll tell you why, because they said, well, we do an estimate at the airport, Gatwick and Heathrow. We just say, are you going to be out of the country for a year? They say, yeah. So, right, you've emigrated. No, it happened to me. I had a job abroad, contract in France. I said, are you going to be out of the country? I said, well, no, I'm coming back every second weekend. Still had a house, had no intention of emigrating. But according to them, they said, where are you going to spend most of your time? The next 12 months, I said, well, in France. They said, right. They must have written me down as I've emigrated. But that's absolute nonsense. Did not emigrate, had no intention of emigrating. You've also got people, they say, well, people have emigrated to Spain. People have gone to Spain for the sunshine. A lot of people have, but they now regret it. They've had their pensions paid in euros, and that's collapsed. There's been a property slump in Spain. They bought at the height of the property market, and their properties have slumped. So they'd like to come back, but they would sell at a loss. And they would come back. If they do come back, there's no way of knowing, because they've got a passport, they can just walk in. So what I'm saying is the number of people who have emigrated has been vastly overrated, overinflated, and the number of people coming in underreported. So we all know what's happening in this country. We're being lied to. Immigration myths, and they keep repeating it day after day, and people are buying into this nonsense. So what we've got to do is fight back. That's why we're active on social media. We're slowly getting more exposure in the media. There was a story about us in the Independent, I don't know if you saw it, yesterday. Our Russia Today, I've had 2 interviews with them published. I've had a third one, she hasn't published it for some reason. And that's another thing. I have plenty of interviews, but many of them are not published. Videos I've done. I did one program at London Live. I've been on there before, but I spoke for half an hour about multiculturalism. I said it's failed, and half an hour, but they didn't show it. So any good news, a lot of them won't show it. But getting back to immigration, it's our core policy, and we want to stop immigration until further notice, until we can sort out this mess. And we're the only party that will say that. All the other parties are in favour of immigration, and their policies won't work. They'll carry on, and it's very destructive to this country. We need to stop immigration. We need to get our points across, and most people do agree, and we've got everything to play for. Now, we must be positive in putting our message across, because we know we're right. We're not far right. So far we have been right about immigration, grooming gangs. We're right about Islamization, but especially on immigration. We're the only party that talks sense about it, and we must be positive and put our message across and give our message to the people. And let's be strong, let's get out there, let's tell it like it is. Thank you very much.